There we are. All right, guys. Following along my series of daily tips for street photography, I said I was going to give you guys 10. Probably going to give you more. Probably a few bonuses in between. But tip number 2. We already talked about tip number 1, which was simple, right? Less is more. Carry one lens, carry one camera body. Tip number 2. Learn that camera body and learn that focal length, okay? Whatever lens you're going to carry, whether it be a 28, a 35, a 50, if you're to telephoto range, an 85, maybe you carry 70 to 200. I don't know what you carry. I carry a 28, I carry a 35. I like those focal lengths. I do experiment with a 50, but let's just say I'm going to walk out with a 28 millimeter lens. That lens has certain characteristics, so I'm going to make sure that I learn that focal length. I'm going to make sure that I have my camera set up, whatever camera body I choose to use for the day, that's the camera that I have set up, and I have it set up correctly for what I'm going to do. So what does that mean for me? So if I'm going to walk out on a New York street or a new city, wherever I am, I'm going to make sure that I have my shutter speed dialed in. So for me, I like to have my camera dialed in at 1/500th of a second, or at least 1/250th of a second. Now that's going to make sure that I freeze movement. If I want to freeze movement on the scene, that's the best way for me to do it. I'm going to usually leave my camera in auto ISO, and usually I'm going to pick an aperture around f8. Now f8 is going to give me an extremely large depth of field, so I know that anything that I really have in front of me in my scene is really going to be in focus. The fast shutter speed is going to make sure that I freeze motion. And auto ISO is going to let the camera expose properly. Now, that doesn't mean I'm not going to manipulate the exposure by using the exposure compensation dial. I ride the exposure compensation. I do it all the time on every video. I ride the exposure compensation dial all the time throughout the day. Usually underexposing. I expose for the extreme highlights and make sure that I reserve some of those details, but I usually end up with an underexposed image for post-processing. Now, again, knowing what your camera is, knowing what your focal length is, make sure that you have your camera dialed in. It's going to make for an easier day. It's going to, again, allow you, just like living simply, just like bringing one camera, it's going to allow you to focus more on the scene in front of you, the streets in front of you, the people, the subjects, the storyline, things that may happen in a split second. You're going to be able to focus on that. You're not going to have to sit there and fiddle around with your camera. You're dialing your settings. You're going to have to do all that. It's already going to be done. You're already going to be hitting the streets, ready to take action, ready to capture whatever may come your way in a moment. So my tip number 2 is to make sure that you have your camera dialed in, make sure that you know your focal length, where you're going to have to be, where you're going to have to stand, to make sure that whatever you want is in that distance, is in that focal length, within your 35 millimeter screen area, that little world of yours. Just make sure that you're all set up and ready to go. That way you never miss a moment. That's my tip number 2. I'll give you tip number 3 next. See ya.